When Dr. Whitman told Miriam Fletcher she was too fat to survive childbirth, she believed her dreams of motherhood had died forever, until a grief-stricken rancher and 3 orphan children arrived on the same devastating winter night. But when the town's most respected physician threatened to tear apart the unconventional family she'd built, would Miriam finally find the courage to prove that a mother's worth isn't measured by her body, but by the fierce love beating in her heart? The church bell's iron voice cut through the morning fog like a blade, but Miriam Fletcher had stopped counting its calls to prayer months ago. Instead, she pressed her face against the cold kitchen window of her boarding house room, watching the good wives of Cedar Falls hurry past with their market baskets and their certainties. Each woman moved with the quick, light steps of someone who belonged in the world, while Miriam felt like a boulder trying to float downstream. Mrs. Patterson's voice drifted up from the dining room below, sharp as winter wind. That Fletcher woman missed Sunday service again. Mark my words, Reverend Miller should have a talk with her about Christian duty. Miriam's fingers tightened on the window frame. She knew what they really meant. A woman her size shouldn't take up space in the Lord's house when proper ladies needed room for their families. She'd heard the whispers after her last visit, seen the way mothers pulled their children closer when she passed, as if being heavy was something they might catch. The October air bit at her cheeks as she stepped onto Main Street 20 minutes later. Her thick wool coat, sewn from fabric meant for winter curtains, wrapped around her like armor that never quite fit right. The wooden sidewalks groaned under her boots, a sound that followed her everywhere like a shame-filled song. "Morning, Miss Fletcher." Young Timothy Walsh tipped his cap as he loaded flour sacks onto his father's wagon. His smile was real, not the tight-lipped politeness most folks gave her. "Good morning, Timothy. How's your mother's cough?" "Much better since you brought that honey remedy. Ma says you're an angel in disguise." An angel in disguise. If only the boy knew how she saw herself. More like a mistake God hadn't finished correcting. The morning market buzzed with the usual gossip. Mrs. Henderson held court near the apple stand, her voice carrying like church bells. "Did you hear about the widow Morrison? Poor woman's trying to manage that farm alone with 3 little ones. Someone ought to help, but who has time these days?" Miriam paused, pretending to examine turnips while she listened. She knew the Morrison place, a struggling patch of land 5 miles east where Sarah Morrison fought to keep food on her table after consumption took her husband last spring. Maybe if she'd been a better wife, Henry wouldn't have worked himself to death, Mrs. Patterson added, her words dripping with false sympathy. Heat rose in Miriam's chest. She'd watched Sarah Morrison cry over her husband's grave just 3 months ago, seen how the young woman's hands shook as she tried to comfort her children. The urge to speak up burned in her throat, but she swallowed it down. Women like her didn't have the right to defend anyone. Dr. Whitman's office sat at the corner of Main and Elm, its painted sign promising modern medical solutions for the progressive family. Miriam had walked past it 100 times, always finding excuses to avoid what waited inside. Today, the letter in her coat pocket felt heavy as a stone. Her sister Margaret's handwriting covered 3 pages of careful script. "Denver has doctors who've studied in Boston and New York. They understand things differently here. Please, Miriam, at least get a proper examination. Don't let one small-town physician decide your entire future." But Cedar Falls was Miriam's entire world. She'd been born in the room above Peterson's bakery, learned to read in the one-room schoolhouse that now sat empty on the prairie's edge. Every street held memories. Every face was familiar. The thought of leaving for the unknown chaos of Denver made her stomach twist with more than just hunger. The bell above Dr. Whitman's door chimed as she entered. The waiting room smelled of carbolic acid and old leather, with wooden chairs arranged in neat rows like pews in a judgmental church. Mrs. Foster sat knitting baby blankets, her rounded belly proudly displayed beneath her blue dress. She was younger than Miriam by 5 years, married for only 8 months, and glowing with the kind of happiness that came from knowing your place in the world. "Oh, hello, Miss Fletcher," Mrs. Foster said, her needles pausing. "How lovely to see you. Are you feeling poorly?" "Just a routine visit," Miriam lied, settling into a chair that creaked ominously under her weight. I'm here for my monthly check. Dr. Whitman says everything's progressing beautifully. Mrs. Foster patted her stomach with the casual ownership of someone who'd never doubted her body's purpose. He predicts a Christmas baby, maybe even Christmas Day itself. Wouldn't that be a blessing? Miriam forced a smile that felt like broken glass. How wonderful for you. The inner door opened, and Dr. Whitman emerged with his previous patient, Mrs. Johnson from the dry goods store, who clutched a bottle of tonic and wore the satisfied expression of someone whose ailments had easy solutions. Miss Fletcher, Dr. Whitman said, his voice carefully neutral. Please come in. His examination room felt more like a courtroom than a place of healing. Medical instruments gleamed on white cloth, and charts showing the human body in perfect proportion covered the walls. Dr. Whitman was a thin man with precise movements and eyes that measured everything they saw. He'd studied medicine in Chicago before settling in Cedar Falls, bringing big city knowledge to prairie problems. I received your request for consultation, he said, settling behind his desk without offering her a chair. You mentioned concerns about matrimonial prospects. Heat flooded Miriam's cheeks. My sister believes you might have misjudged my situation. She thinks city doctors might. Miss Fletcher. His voice cut through her words like a scalpel. I've practiced medicine for 15 years. I've delivered over 200 babies and attended more difficult births than I care to remember. Your sister's optimism, while touching, doesn't change basic anatomical facts. He pulled out a thick file with her name written in his careful script. I examined you thoroughly 18 months ago when you first inquired about marriage possibilities. My conclusions haven't changed simply because time has passed. Miriam's hands twisted in her lap. Outside the window, she could see normal women going about their normal lives, buying bread, chatting with neighbors, planning dinners for husbands who came home expecting warmth and conversation. But surely medical knowledge advances. New techniques, different approaches. Some things don't change, Miss Fletcher. The laws of physics apply to human bodies just as they do to everything else. Your excessive weight has already caused significant strain on your heart and joints. The additional stress of pregnancy would be... He paused, choosing his words with surgical precision. Let's say it would be inadvisable for any man who cared about your survival. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing closer like the sides of a coffin. Miriam had come here hoping for different words, a different future, but Dr. Whitman spoke with the authority of education and experience. What if I lost weight, changed my diet, took up walking? Miss Fletcher, you are 28 years old. If significant weight loss were possible for you, it would have happened naturally by now. Your constitution is what it is. Accepting that fact will save you considerable heartache. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Foster's cheerful voice discussing nursery preparations with the nurse. The sound felt like salt poured into an open wound. However, Dr. Whitman continued, there are other ways to contribute to society, teaching, perhaps, or charitable work. Many unmarried women find great satisfaction in serving others rather than pursuing domestic impossibilities. Serving others, as if her only value lay in what she could give away rather than what she might receive. I appreciate your time, Doctor, Miriam managed, standing on legs that felt unsteady. I hope you'll consider my advice seriously. False hope only leads to greater disappointment. The October wind had picked up while she was inside, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. Miriam pulled her coat tighter and started the long walk back to her boarding house, Dr. Whitman's words echoing in her head like funeral bells. But as she passed the empty schoolhouse on the edge of town, something made her stop. The building sat abandoned since the new school was built closer to Main Street, its windows dark but somehow welcoming. She'd always loved that old schoolhouse, loved the way afternoon light slanted through its windows and the stories its walls seemed to hold. Maybe she couldn't have the life she dreamed of, but she could still find places where dreams felt possible. Mrs. Fletcher, I need you to understand what we're discussing here. Dr. Whitman removed his spectacles and cleaned them with methodical precision, each movement designed to emphasize the gravity of his words. This isn't a matter of opinion or hope. This is medical science. Miriam sat rigidly in the wooden chair across from his mahogany desk, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She'd been Mrs. Fletcher for exactly 3 weeks now, ever since James McCready had surprised everyone in Cedar Falls by proposing to the woman they'd all written off as a permanent spinster. The new copper ring on her finger felt foreign and precious, like wearing someone else's jewelry in a dream. "I understand you're speaking from your medical training," she said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. "But James and I hoped that perhaps. Mr. McCready is a good man, but sentiment doesn't change anatomy." Dr. Whitman spread several papers across his desk, charts and diagrams that reduced her body to measurements and mechanical problems. "Your pelvic structure, combined with your excessive adipose tissue, creates an impossible situation. The birth canal would never accommodate a full-term infant." The words hit her like physical blows. Adipose tissue, birth canal, clinical terms that turned her hopes into medical impossibilities. Outside the window, Cedar Falls continued its autumn rhythm. Children ran past the office, their laughter carrying on the wind like music from another world. Mrs. Henderson pushed her baby carriage down Main Street, stopping to chat with neighbors who cooed over her newest addition. The sight made Miriam's chest tighten with something that felt like drowning. "What exactly are you telling me, Doctor?" Dr. Whitman leaned back in his leather chair, his expression a mixture of professional duty and personal distaste. "I'm telling you that pregnancy would likely kill you before the 7th month. If by some miracle you survived that long, labor would certainly prove fatal. The infant would die as well, trapped by the very body that should have nurtured it." The room seemed to tilt sideways. Miriam gripped the arms of her chair, fighting against a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with morning sickness and everything to do with watching her future crumble like old paper. "There must be something, surgical procedures, different positions for delivery. Excuse me, Mrs. Fletcher." His correction carried a note of surprise, as if he still couldn't believe someone had actually married her. "Modern medicine has limits. We're not magicians, despite what some people seem to think." He opened a thick medical textbook, its pages yellowed with age and authority. Dr. Richardson's obstetrical guide clearly states that women of your proportions should never attempt childbearing. The mortality rate approaches 90%. 90%. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. Miriam thought of James, probably working in his south pasture at this very moment, unaware that his new wife was discovering she could never give him the children he'd lost. When he'd proposed by the creek last month, his eyes had held such hope, not just for companionship, but for the possibility of rebuilding the family that consumption had stolen from him. "What if we waited? If I tried to lose weight, improved my health? Mrs. Fletcher, you're 28 years old. Your body is what it is. These aren't temporary conditions that diet and exercise can remedy." Dr. Whitman's tone suggested he was losing patience with her refusal to accept reality. "Weight distribution in women of your type is determined by fundamental constitutional factors. Biblical scripture reminds us that some are called to different purposes." Different purposes. As if God had marked her from birth as unfit for the most basic function of womanhood. The door to the waiting room opened, and voices drifted in. Mrs. Patterson discussing her daughter's pregnancy symptoms with the nurse, their words full of excited anticipation. Someone mentioned baby names and nursery colors, normal concerns for normal women living normal lives. "However," Dr. Whitman continued, "there are many ways to find fulfillment without motherhood. Your new husband has his ranch, you have your domestic duties. Many couples live perfectly content lives without children." Content. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. Miriam's mind wandered to James's first wife, Elizabeth, whose portrait still hung in their bedroom. Elizabeth had been tiny and delicate, with the kind of figure that poets wrote about and doctors approved of. She'd given James twin sons who lived just long enough for him to love them desperately before consumption claimed all three in a single terrible winter. Sometimes Miriam caught James staring at that portrait with an expression she couldn't quite read. Was he remembering what it felt like to be a father? Was he wondering what he'd gained by trading Elizabeth's memory for Miriam's solid, disappointing reality? "I need to ask you something else, Doctor." The words came out before she could stop them. The other women in town, they seemed to think my condition might be contagious somehow, that being around me might affect their own prospects for healthy children. Dr. Whitman's eyebrows rose. "That's superstitious nonsense, of course. Your particular constitutional issues are individual to you. But they avoid me at church socials. Mrs. Henderson actually moved her children to the other side of the sanctuary last Sunday when I sat down near them. People fear what they don't understand. Your presence serves as an uncomfortable reminder that not all women are equipped for traditional roles." Equipped. Another clinical word that reduced her to a collection of failed parts. The clock on his desk chimed twice, 2 o'clock, which meant James would be expecting her home soon. She told him this was just a routine visit, a new wife's consultation with the family doctor. She hadn't mentioned the desperate hope that had driven her here, the secret prayer that maybe Dr. Whitman would have different answers now that she was married and respectable. "Is there anything else, Mrs. Fletcher?" Miriam stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. The medical charts on his desk showed women's bodies in cross-section, all the mysterious internal structures that were supposed to work together to create life. Her own body felt like a broken clock, all the pieces present but arranged wrong, unable to perform its intended function. "Thank you for your time, Doctor. I hope you'll discuss this honestly with your husband. False expectations only lead to greater disappointment down the road." The afternoon sun seemed too bright as she stepped onto Main Street. Around her, Cedar Falls hummed with its usual activities. Merchants closing up shop, children racing home from school, women hanging laundry that snapped in the October wind like surrender flags. At Morrison's General Store, Sarah Morrison stood at the counter with her 3 young children clustered around her skirts. The widow looked exhausted, her dress carefully mended in several places, but she smiled as the storekeeper weighed out flour and sugar for her meager purchases. "That should last you through the week," Mr. Morrison was saying. "And don't worry about the bill. James McCready settled your account this morning." Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment and gratitude. "That's very kind of him. I don't know how to thank." "No need for thanks. James said you've got enough to worry about without fretting over grocery bills." Miriam's heart swelled with pride even through her own pain. This was the man she'd married, someone who quietly helped struggling neighbors without expecting recognition or gratitude. He deserved a wife who could give him sons to carry on his name, daughters to fill his house with laughter. Instead, he'd gotten her. The walk home seemed endless. Every step took her further from the hope she'd carried into Dr. Whitman's office and closer to a conversation that would break both their hearts. The ring on her finger caught the late afternoon light, its simple beauty mocking the complicated impossibility of her situation. As she crested the hill that overlooked the McCready Ranch, she could see James working in the corral with his horses. Even from a distance, she could tell he was watching for her return, probably planning to ask about her visit with the casual interest of a caring husband. How could she tell him that the future they'd tentatively begun to imagine, children running through these same fields, voices filling the house that had been too quiet for too long, would never exist? The front door of their home stood open, welcoming her back to a life that suddenly felt like an elaborate pretense. Inside, James had left wildflowers on the kitchen table, probably picked during his lunch break as a surprise for her return. Such a small gesture, but it broke something inside her chest that Dr. Whitman's clinical pronouncements had only cracked. She was Mrs. James McCready now, but she would never be the mother of the McCready children. The question that would haunt her through the coming weeks settled over her like prairie twilight. How long could a marriage survive when one person's dreams required the other person's body to transform into something it could never be? The sound of crying came from inside the old schoolhouse, and James McCready stopped his horse so fast the animal nearly stumbled. He had ridden this path 100 times, always alone, always seeking the peace that empty places offered a man carrying too much grief. But today, someone else had found his secret hiding spot. The wooden building sat crooked on the prairie like a forgotten memory, its windows cloudy with age and its door hanging loose on rusted hinges. Most folks in Cedar Falls had forgotten it existed. James tied his horse to a fence post and walked closer. Through the dirty glass, he could see a woman sitting on the floor, her back against the wall. Her shoulders shook with each sob, and something about the way she held herself, like she was trying to make herself smaller, made his chest tighten. He knew that feeling. The door creaked when he pushed it open, and the woman's head snapped up. Even with tears on her cheeks, James recognized her immediately. Miriam Fletcher, the woman the whole town whispered about when they thought no one was listening. Oh! She scrambled to stand, wiping her face with her sleeve. I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone. I'll leave right away. No need to run off, James said, removing his hat. Snow from the October storm melted on his shoulders, leaving dark spots on his brown coat. This place belongs to everyone and no one. Miriam clutched a book against her chest like a shield. Her dress was simple but clean, dark blue wool that had seen better days but was well cared for. Her hair, the color of autumn leaves, had escaped its pins and hung in curls around her face. I come here to read sometimes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. When the house gets too quiet. James understood quiet houses. His own place echoed with ghosts and memories that wouldn't stay buried. What's the book? She turned it so he could see the cover. Jane Eyre. Have you read it? My wife used to read it aloud in the evenings. The words came out before he could stop them. He rarely spoke of Sarah to anyone, but something about this woman's sadness made his own feel less heavy. Used to. Miriam's voice was gentle, careful. She died 3 years back. Consumption. James moved to the old teacher's desk and sat on its edge. Took our boys too. Twins. They were barely walking. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called to its mate. I'm sorry, Miriam said finally. That's a terrible loss. James nodded. What brings you here crying over Charlotte Bronte? A flush crept up Miriam's neck. She looked down at her hands, then back at him. Something in his face must have told her he wouldn't judge, because she sat back down on the floor and smoothed her skirt around her. I went to see Dr. Whitman today, she said. About whether I might someday. She stopped, shook her head. It doesn't matter now. Seems like it matters plenty to you. Miriam was quiet for so long that James thought she wouldn't answer. Then she looked up at him with eyes the color of dark honey. He told me I'm too fat to have children. That any man who married me would be a fool because I'd probably die if I ever tried to give birth. The words came out in a rush, like she needed to say them quickly before she lost her nerve. James felt anger rise in his chest. Not at her, but at the cruel way the world treated people who didn't fit its narrow ideas of what was right. Dr. Whitman's good at fixing broken bones, but he's not much for understanding hearts. But he's right, isn't he? Miriam's voice cracked. Look at me. I'm not what anyone would want. You're not what small minds expect, James said firmly. That's different. Miriam stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. James understood why. In a town like Cedar Falls, kindness to someone like her probably felt as rare as rain in August. The wind picked up outside, howling through the gaps in the walls. James looked around the old schoolhouse, remembering when it had been full of children's voices and chalk dust and hope for the future. Now it was just a shelter for broken people seeking peace. You know what I think? He said, standing up and walking to the window. I think Dr. Whitman's never had to live with real loss. Never had to learn that the most important things in life can't be measured or weighed or judged by looking at the outside. What do you mean? James turned back to her. My Sarah was tiny, barely came up to my shoulder, pretty as a spring flower and delicate as china. Everyone said we'd have beautiful children, that she was perfect for bearing sons. His voice grew rough. But when the consumption came, all that delicate beauty couldn't save her. Couldn't save our boys either. Miriam's eyes filled with tears again, but they were different tears now. Not for herself, but for him. Sometimes I think, James continued, that God cares less about what we look like and more about what we're made of inside. The stuff that doesn't show on the outside, courage, kindness, the ability to love even when it hurts. You really believe that? I have to. Otherwise, nothing makes sense. They sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon light faded outside. James found himself studying Miriam's face when she wasn't looking. There was intelligence in her eyes, and a gentleness that reminded him of his mother. She wasn't beautiful in the way Sarah had been, but there was something solid about her, something real. Can I ask you something? Miriam said suddenly. Go ahead. Why are you being kind to me? Most people. She gestured vaguely, as if the rest of the sentence was too painful to finish. James considered the question. Why was he sitting in an abandoned schoolhouse talking to a woman he barely knew? Why did her pain feel so familiar? Maybe because I know what it's like to have people whisper about you, he said finally. After Sarah and the boys died, folks didn't know what to say to me. Some acted like grief was catching. Others kept trying to fix me, introduce me to their daughters or nieces, like a new wife would make me forget what I'd lost. That must have been awful. It was lonely, James admitted. Still is most days. But sitting here with you, it's the first time in 3 years that I've felt like someone might understand. Miriam looked down at her book, running her finger along the edge of the pages. Jane Eyre was lonely too, but she found someone who loved her just as she was. Maybe that's not just a story, James said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Miriam's cheeks flushed pink, and she looked everywhere except at him. I should probably head home, she said, standing up and straightening her skirt. Mrs. Patterson will wonder where I've gotten to. You bored with the Pattersons? In their attic room. It's small, but it's mine. She gathered her shawl around her shoulders. Thank you for being kind, for listening. James stood too, reaching for his hat. Will you be back? To read? Miriam paused at the door, looking back at him with something that might have been hope. Would that be all right? I come here most afternoons when the ranch work's done, he said. Company would be welcome. As she walked away, her footsteps crunching in the snow, James watched until she disappeared over the rise. For the first time in 3 years, the empty schoolhouse didn't feel quite so empty. And for the first time since Dr. Whitman's cruel words, Miriam Fletcher walked with her head held just a little bit higher. 3 days later, Miriam arrived at the schoolhouse to find smoke curling from the old chimney and the scent of coffee drifting through the crisp air. She hesitated at the door, suddenly uncertain. Had she misunderstood? Maybe James had simply been polite, the way people were when they felt sorry for you. Maybe he hadn't really meant for her to come back. But then the door opened, and James stood there with a tin cup in his hand and something that might have been relief on his weathered face. Thought you might not come, he said simply. I wasn't sure you meant it, Miriam replied honestly. I always mean what I say. He stepped aside to let her in. Coffee's hot if you want some. The schoolhouse felt different with the fire burning. Warmer, more alive. James had swept the floor and arranged 2 wooden crates as makeshift chairs near the old potbelly stove. On the teacher's desk, he'd set out a coffee pot, 2 cups, and a paper-wrapped bundle that smelled like fresh bread. You brought food, Miriam observed, surprised. Figured if we're going to make a habit of this, we might as well do it right. James poured coffee into the second cup and handed it to her. Mrs. Henderson makes the best bread in 3 counties. Bought a loaf from her this morning. Miriam nearly choked on her coffee. Mrs. Henderson sold you bread? After She stopped, embarrassed. After what? After she saw us talking at church last Sunday. I heard her telling Mrs. Whitman that it was highly inappropriate for a man of your standing to associate with someone like me. James's jaw tightened. Did she now? She's not wrong, James. People are already talking. If they see us meeting like this. Miriam set down her cup with shaking hands. I don't want to cause trouble for you. Let me tell you something about trouble, James said, sitting on his crate and leaning forward. Real trouble is losing everyone you love in the space of 6 months. Real trouble is lying awake at night wondering if God's forgotten your name. Mrs. Henderson's gossip. He waved his hand dismissively. That's just noise. Miriam stared at him, amazed by his certainty. In her world, other people's opinions had always mattered more than her own feelings. They determined where she could go, what she could do, even what she was allowed to hope for. How do you do that? She asked quietly. Do what? Not care what people think. James was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. I used to care. When Sarah was sick, I worried about what folks would say if I couldn't save her. Worried they'd think I wasn't a good enough husband, wasn't strong enough to protect my family. He looked up at Miriam. Then she died anyway, and I realized all that worrying hadn't changed a thing. The only opinions that matter are the ones from people who actually care about you. And if there aren't any people like that, then you start with yourself. Learn to be your own friend first. Miriam had never thought of it that way. She'd spent so many years trying to make herself smaller, quieter, less noticeable, that she'd forgotten she had the right to take up space in the world. Tell me about your family, James said, changing the subject as he unwrapped the bread. You mentioned a sister in Denver. Margaret. She's 2 years younger and everything I'm not. Small, pretty, married to a banker. Miriam accepted a piece of bread, still warm and fragrant. She writes every month, asking me to visit. I think she feels sorry for me. Maybe she misses you. Maybe. Miriam took a bite of bread and closed her eyes. When had she last tasted something this good? When had she last sat with someone who seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say? What about your parents? Gone. Papa died when I was 16, and Mama followed 2 years later. That's when Margaret went to Denver and I stayed here. She didn't mention that Margaret had invited her to come along, or that she'd been too afraid of being a burden on her sister's new life. That's young to be on your own. I managed. Mrs. Patterson needed help with her boarding house, and I needed somewhere to stay. It worked out. But as she said it, Miriam realized how small her life had become. Work, church, home, repeat. The same faces, the same conversations, the same careful steps to avoid drawing attention to herself. What did you want to be when you were little? James asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. What do you mean? Before the world told you what you couldn't do, what did you dream about? Miriam felt heat rise in her cheeks. You'll think it's silly. Try me. She looked down at her hands, wrapped around the warm coffee cup. I wanted to be a teacher. I loved books, loved learning new things. I thought maybe I could help other children discover that feeling too. What stopped you? The school board said I wasn't suitable. Said parents wouldn't want someone like me influencing their children. The rejection still stung even after 10 years. James was quiet for a long moment. When Miriam finally looked up, she saw anger in his blue eyes. Not at her, but for her. Their loss, he said firmly. Any child would be lucky to have a teacher who understands what it means to love books the way you do. It doesn't matter now, doesn't it? James stood up and walked to the old blackboard, still hanging crooked on the wall. He picked up a piece of chalk from the ledge and wrote something in careful letters. What does this say? Miriam squinted at the board. Hope is the thing with feathers. Emily Dickinson. Sarah used to quote that poem when things got difficult. He set down the chalk and turned back to her. Maybe teaching doesn't have to happen in a schoolroom. Maybe it happens wherever someone who loves learning meets someone else who needs to know they're not alone. Something warm unfurled in Miriam's chest, something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was. Hope, fragile as a bird's wing, but there nonetheless. "You're different from what I expected," she said softly. "What did you expect?" "Most men who've lost what you've lost become bitter, angry at the world." James sat back down, his expression thoughtful. "I was angry for a while. Angry at God, at the doctors, at every family that got to stay whole while mine fell apart. But anger's a heavy thing to carry, and I was already carrying enough. So what changed? Time mostly, and realizing that Sarah wouldn't want me to waste whatever years I have left being angry." He looked directly at Miriam. "She used to say that love doesn't disappear when someone dies. It just has to find new places to go." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that neither of them was quite ready to name. Outside, the wind had picked up again, but inside the schoolhouse, Miriam felt warmer than she had in months. "I should probably go," she said reluctantly. "It'll be dark soon. Will you come back tomorrow?" The question was simple, but Miriam heard the loneliness underneath it. She heard her own loneliness echoing back. "If you want me to." "Ido." As she gathered her things, James walked to the window and peered out at the darkening sky. "Storm's coming in fast. Let me ride with you back to town." "That's not necessary." "It's not about necessary. It's about what's right." Outside, James helped her up onto his horse, his hands gentle but sure. As they rode through the gathering dusk, Miriam found herself acutely aware of his presence behind her. His warmth, his steady breathing, the way he adjusted his grip on the reins to keep her from sliding. When they reached the edge of town, he stopped. "This is far enough," Miriam said, starting to dismount. "People might see if you come any closer." James caught her arm gently. "Miriam." She looked back at him, her heart beating faster at the sound of her name on his lips. "Don't let other people's small minds make you smaller than you are," he said quietly. "You're worth more than their opinions." As she walked the last few blocks to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, Miriam felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility that tomorrow might be different from today. Behind her, James watched until she was safely inside, then turned his horse toward home and the empty house that waited for him there. But for the first time in 3 years, the emptiness didn't feel quite so vast. James McCready just rode past the Henderson place again. Mrs. Patterson's sharp voice cut through the morning air like a knife through butter as Miriam picked up fresh eggs from the chicken coop behind Miller's store. The words made Miriam's stomach flip like a pancake on a hot griddle. For 3 weeks now, she and James had been meeting at the old schoolhouse. What started as accident had turned into something she looked forward to more than Sunday dinner. But in a town where everybody knew everybody else's business, secrets didn't stay hidden long. "Third time this week," Mrs. Patterson continued, not caring that Miriam stood right there listening. "And that Henderson girl Sarah has been asking all kinds of questions about when he might be looking for a new wife." Miriam's fingers tightened on the egg basket until her knuckles turned white. Sarah Henderson was everything Miriam wasn't: tiny as a bird, pretty as a picture, and young enough to give a man all the children he could want. The thought made Miriam's chest hurt worse than the time she'd fallen off the church steps. The cold December wind whipped through her thick wool coat as she hurried toward the schoolhouse. Snow crunched under her boots like broken glass. Each step reminded her of Dr. Whitman's words from months ago. Any man who would marry you would be either a fool or a saint. But when she pushed open the schoolhouse door and saw James already there, building up the fire with those careful hands of his, something warm spread through her chest. He looked up when she entered, and his whole face changed, like the sun coming out from behind storm clouds. "Thought you might not come today," he said, standing up and brushing ash from his pants. "Storm's getting worse. Takes more than a little snow to keep me away." Miriam set down her basket and unwrapped the fresh bread she'd brought. The smell of yeast and flour filled the small room, mixing with smoke in a way that felt like home. They settled into their usual spots, him on the old teacher's chair, her on the bench by the window where she could watch the snow fall. For a while, they just listened to the fire crackle and pop. Then James pulled out a worn leather book. "Found this in my wife's things," he said quietly. "Thought you might like it." Miriam took the book with gentle hands. The cover was soft from years of touching, and when she opened it, she saw pressed flowers between the pages. Wildflowers from the prairie, still holding their colors after all these years. "She collected them every spring," James explained. "Said they proved that beautiful things could grow anywhere, even in hard ground." The words hit Miriam like a punch to the stomach. She touched one of the delicate petals, thinking about how different she was from James's first wife. The woman in the photograph on his mantel was small and delicate, like these flowers. Not big and sturdy like a plow horse, which is how Miriam often felt. "She sounds wonderful," Miriam whispered. She was. James stared into the fire. "But she's gone, and I'm still here, still breathing, still hoping for something good to happen." Before Miriam could ask what he meant, the door burst open. Cold air rushed in along with Tom Miller, the store owner's teenage son. His face was red from running, and ice crystals hung from his eyebrows. "Mr. McCready," Tom gasped, trying to catch his breath. "You need to come quick. Your cattle broke through the fence. They're scattered all over the Henderson property, and Mr. Henderson is madder than a wet cat." James jumped up so fast his chair tipped over. "How many got out?" "Most of the herd, sir. Maybe 30 or 40 head. And there's a blizzard coming in from the north. If we don't get them rounded up soon." He didn't need to finish. Everyone in cattle country knew what happened to cows caught in a blizzard. James grabbed his coat and hat, then stopped and looked back at Miriam. "I have to go," he said, and she could see the worry lines around his eyes. "Of course you do." Miriam stood up too, smoothing down her skirts. "Be careful out there." For a moment, James looked like he wanted to say something else. Then Tom shifted impatiently by the door, and the moment passed. "I'll see you when this is over," James said, then followed Tom out into the storm. Miriam stood alone in the suddenly quiet schoolhouse, listening to the wind howl around the corners. Through the frost-covered window, she could just make out the shapes of men on horseback riding hard toward the Henderson ranch. One of them was James, risking his neck for a bunch of stubborn cows. She spent the rest of the afternoon pacing the small room, jumping every time the wind rattled the windows. When darkness fell and James still hadn't returned, she finally gave up and walked home through the deepening snow. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she pictured James out there in the storm, or worse, pictured him at the Henderson house, where Sarah would be waiting with hot coffee and dry clothes and a smile that promised everything Miriam couldn't give. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with snow piled 3 feet deep against the buildings. Miriam dressed quickly and made her way to Miller's store for news. The place was buzzing with talk about the storm and the cattle roundup. "Took them most of the night," Mr. Miller was saying to a group of men warming themselves around the pot-bellied stove. "Lost 2 calves to the cold, but they saved the rest." McCready and his men worked like demons to get those animals to safety. "Henderson wasn't too happy about his fence," someone else added. "But McCready made it right. Always does." Miriam bought some supplies she didn't really need, just to have an excuse to listen. Finally, Mrs. Patterson came in, shaking snow off her boots and looking like a cat with a bowl of cream. "Well," she announced to anyone who would listen, "I just came from the Henderson place. Sarah made enough breakfast for an army, feeding all those men who worked through the night. She certainly knows how to take care of folks." The words were aimed right at Miriam, sharp as arrows. Mrs. Patterson's eyes found hers across the store. "James McCready looked mighty grateful for her kindness too," she continued. "A man appreciates a woman who knows how to make him comfortable after a hard night's work." Miriam's cheeks burned hot as a branding iron. She grabbed her packages and headed for the door, but Mrs. Patterson wasn't finished. "Course, some women are better suited for kitchen work than others," she said loud enough for the whole store to hear. Takes a certain delicacy to make a proper home. The words followed Miriam out into the cold air. She walked home with her head down, trying not to think about James sitting at Sarah Henderson's kitchen table, eating food cooked by small, capable hands while Sarah smiled and fluttered around him like a butterfly. That afternoon, she almost didn't go to the schoolhouse. But something drew her there anyway, maybe the need to know for sure where things stood. When she arrived, the building was empty and cold. No fire in the stove, no sign that James had been there at all. She waited for 2 hours, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. Just as she was about to give up and go home, she heard horses approaching. Through the window, she saw James riding up with another man she didn't recognize. They dismounted and came inside, bringing the smell of leather and cold air with them. James looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes and stubble on his chin. When he saw Miriam, relief washed over his face. "Thank God you're here," he said. "I was afraid you might think." "This is my cousin Pete from Dodge City," James said quickly, gesturing to the other man. "Pete, this is Miriam Fletcher." Pete touched his hat politely, but his eyes were curious as they looked between James and Miriam. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am. Pete's thinking about buying some land around here," James explained. "I was showing him the area." But Miriam could tell there was more to it than that. Something in the way Pete looked at James, like he was worried about him. Something in the way James kept glancing at her, like he was trying to read her thoughts. They made small talk for a while about the weather and the cattle business. Then Pete excused himself to look around outside, leaving James and Miriam alone. "About last night," James started, but Miriam held up her hand to stop him. "You don't owe me any explanations," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're just friends who meet here sometimes. Nothing more." James stared at her for a long moment. Then he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his blue eyes. "Is that really what you think?" he asked quietly. "That we're just friends?" Before Miriam could answer, Pete called from outside. "James, better come see this." The spell broke. James hesitated, then went to see what his cousin wanted. Through the window, Miriam watched them talking in low voices, their heads bent together over something Pete was showing him. When they came back inside, both men looked serious. "There's been some talk in town," Pete said carefully, "about you and the lady here. Some folks think it might be better if..." "If what?" James's voice had gone cold as winter wind. Pete glanced at Miriam, then back at his cousin. "If you thought about other options. There's a nice young woman in Dodge City, daughter of a cattle buyer. Good family, good prospects." The words hit Miriam like a slap. She stood up quickly, gathering her things. "I should go," she said, not trusting her voice to stay steady. But James caught her arm gently. "Don't leave because of this. It's getting late anyway," she said, not meeting his eyes. "And people will talk if I stay too long." The truth was, people were already talking. And from the sound of it, they weren't saying anything good. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Miriam couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The question was whether it would change for better or worse. They had just reached the edge of town when they heard the sound of a train whistle in the distance. The morning freight was arriving right on schedule, bringing supplies and mail from the outside world. James and Miriam were planning to head straight to the ranch for a quiet wedding breakfast when they saw Sheriff Collins riding toward them at full gallop. "James! Miriam! Wait up!" he called, his horse kicking up clouds of dust. They stopped and waited, watching the sheriff's face with growing concern. Something was wrong. Sheriff Collins looked worried and excited and confused all at the same time. "What is it, Sheriff?" James asked as the man pulled his horse to a stop. "Got a telegram this morning. From Topeka." Sheriff Collins wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "There's been a train accident. Bad one. People killed." Miriam felt her stomach drop. "How terrible. But what does that have to do with us?" "Well, that's the thing. The sheriff pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. The telegram says there are 3 children who survived. Orphans now. They need a place to stay. And the authorities in Topeka heard about families in our area who might be willing to take them in. James and Miriam looked at each other in surprise. Sheriff, we just got married 20 minutes ago, James said with a confused laugh. We're not exactly prepared for children. I know. This crazy timing. Sheriff Collins shook his head. But here's the thing, the children are already on their way. They'll be on the afternoon train. And every other family in town has already said no. Said no? Miriam couldn't hide her shock. But they're children. Orphan children. That's what I said. The sheriff shrugged helplessly. But people have their reasons. The Hendersons say they can't afford more mouths to feed. The Millers just had a baby of their own. The Johnsons say their house is too small. Miriam felt something stirring in her chest. Something fierce and protective that she had never felt before. What about Dr. Whitman? Surely he and his wife. Nope. Says children are too much work at his age. Sheriff Collins looked embarrassed to be delivering this news. Look, I hate to ask this of you folks on your wedding day, but would you consider taking them in? Just temporarily, until we can find somewhere permanent. James looked at Miriam, searching her face for answers. They had talked about children, dreamed about them, but this was happening so fast. They had been married for less than an hour, and now they were being asked to become parents by dinner time. How old are they? Miriam asked quietly. Let's see. The sheriff consulted his telegram again. Emma, age 12. Thomas, age 8. And Benjamin, age 5. 3 children. 3 babies who had lost everything and everyone they loved. 3 little souls who needed a safe place to land in a world that had suddenly become dark and scary. Miriam thought about her own childhood, about the times she had felt alone and unwanted. She thought about the cruel words people had spoken about her over the years, about how it felt to be rejected and unwelcome. She couldn't let that happen to these children. We'll take them, she said firmly, before James could even respond. James stared at her in amazement. Miriam, are you sure? We don't know anything about raising children. We don't have beds for them or clothes or... We'll figure it out. Miriam's voice was stronger than she had ever heard it. Those children need a family and we need... Well, maybe we need them too. Sheriff Collins let out a long breath of relief. Thank you both. I know this isn't how you plan to spend your wedding day, but... Actually, James interrupted, a slow smile spreading across his face. Maybe it's exactly how we were supposed to spend it. As they rode back toward the ranch to prepare for their unexpected guests, Miriam felt something she had never experienced before. Purpose. For years, she had felt useless, broken, unwanted. But now, 3 children were coming who needed exactly what she had to offer: love, protection, and a fierce determination to prove that families could be built in the most unexpected ways. The afternoon train whistle sounded in the distance, carrying their new life toward them like a prayer answered in the most surprising way possible. But would 3 grieving children accept love from strangers who looked nothing like the families they had lost? The sound of breaking glass shattered the peaceful morning air as Benjamin dropped his milk cup on the kitchen floor. But it wasn't the accident that made Miriam's blood turn cold. It was the sight of Dr. Whitman's black carriage rolling up their dirt road, followed by 2 other wagons she didn't recognize. Emma, take the boys upstairs, Miriam whispered, her hands already shaking as she reached for her apron strings. Through the window, she watched 3 stern-faced men climb down from their wagons, their dark suits making them look like vultures circling a dying animal. James burst through the back door, his face grim. They've brought the county officials with them. Dr. Whitman's knock came hard and demanding, like the fist of judgment itself. When Miriam opened the door, his cold gray eyes swept over her with the same disgust she remembered from that terrible day in his office 6 months ago. Mrs. McCready, he said, her married name dripping from his lips like poison. We need to discuss the welfare of those children. Behind him stood Mr. Patterson from the county courthouse and Reverend Mills from the Presbyterian church, men whose opinions could destroy everything she'd built. Her heart hammered so hard she worried they might hear it. "The children are fine," James said, stepping beside his wife. His voice stayed calm, but Miriam could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. "That remains to be seen." Dr. Whitman pushed past them into the house without invitation, his eyes scanning their modest but clean home like he was searching for evidence of neglect. "I've received several complaints about the unusual nature of this arrangement." The other men followed him inside, their heavy boots tracking mud across Miriam's carefully scrubbed floors. Mr. Patterson pulled out a leather folder thick with papers, while Reverend Mills clasped his hands behind his back and frowned at the children's drawings stuck to the icebox. "What kind of complaints?" Miriam asked, though she already knew the answer. Mrs. Henderson had been busy spreading her poison through town like butter on warm bread. "Concerns about your ability to properly care for growing children," Dr. Whitman replied, setting his black bag on her kitchen table without asking. "Your physical limitations make you unsuitable for the demands of motherhood." Tom appeared at the top of the stairs, his young face pale with worry. "Are they taking us away?" he whispered. The question hit Miriam like a punch to the stomach. She thought of all the nights she'd sat beside their beds when nightmares came, all the scraped knees she'd bandaged, all the tears she'd dried with gentle hands and patient words. "Nobody's taking anyone anywhere," James said firmly, but Mr. Patterson was already shaking his head. "Actually, Mr. McCready, we have authority to remove children from homes deemed unfit. The state has standards for proper guardianship." Miriam felt the familiar shame rising in her throat, the same crushing weight that had pressed down on her for years. These men saw her size, her childless past, her failure to meet society's narrow idea of what a mother should be. They saw everything except what mattered most. "What standards?" she heard herself asking. Her voice sounded stronger than she felt. Dr. Whitman opened his bag and pulled out a thick file. "Medical evaluation shows you're physically incapable of proper child-rearing activities. Lifting, running, providing adequate supervision during emergencies." "I can lift a 50-pound sack of flour," Miriam replied quietly. "I can run faster than Tom when we raced to the creek. Last week, I climbed onto the roof to rescue Benjamin's kitten when it got stuck." "Mrs. McCready," Reverend Mills interrupted, his voice heavy with false kindness, "no one questions your intentions, but these children need guidance from someone who can set a proper example of Christian womanhood." Emma appeared beside Tom on the stairs, her 12-year-old face fierce with protective anger. "She is a proper example. She reads us stories every night and teaches us arithmetic and never yells when Benjamin has accidents." "Children don't understand what's best for them," Mr. Patterson said, making notes in his folder. "That's why adults must make these difficult decisions." Miriam looked at Emma's defiant chin, Tom's worried eyes, and Benjamin peeking around the corner with his thumb in his mouth. 3 months ago, they'd been strangers on a train platform. Now they were her heart walking around outside her body. "You want to know about proper examples?" Miriam's voice grew stronger with each word. "Let me tell you what these children have learned in our home." She moved to the kitchen window, gesturing toward the garden where neat rows of vegetables grew in the spring sunshine. "Emma learned that hard work feeds a family. Tom discovered that being gentle with animals makes them trust you. Benjamin found out that someone will always come when he calls for help in the night." Dr. Whitman snorted. "Sentiment doesn't override medical facts." "Then let's talk about facts." James stepped forward, his blue eyes flashing with anger. "Emma's grades improved from failing to honor roll since she came here. Tom gained 8 pounds and hasn't had a single sick day. Benjamin's nightmares stopped completely after the first month." "Nevertheless," Mr. Patterson said, his pen scratching across the paper, "the state requires proper qualifications for guardianship. Mrs. McCready's condition raises serious questions about long-term suitability." The word condition hung in the air like a curse. Miriam had heard it whispered behind her back for years, her size, her childlessness, her failure to fit the mold of acceptable womanhood. She'd believed those whispers for so long that they'd become the voice in her own head. But as she looked at the 3 children on the stairs, her children, chosen and choosing, something fundamental shifted inside her chest. "Gentlemen," she said, walking to the stove where a pot of soup simmered for lunch, "let me ask you something. When Tom fell out of the apple tree last week and broke his arm, who carried him 2 miles to Dr. Peterson's office?" She ladled soup into bowls, her movements calm and deliberate despite the storm raging in her heart. When Emma cried for 3 hours about the mean girls at school calling her an orphan, who held her until the tears stopped? When Benjamin got lost during the church picnic, who searched every inch of the woods until we found him asleep under the old oak tree? Dr. Whitman's face was growing red with frustration. Physical capability isn't measured by isolated incidents. "You're right," Miriam interrupted, setting the bowls on the table with steady hands. "It's measured by consistency, by showing up every single day, even when it's hard, by choosing love over fear, again and again and again." She turned to face the 3 men, her brown eyes blazing with a fire they'd never seen before. "I may not fit your idea of what a mother should look like, but I know what a mother should feel like. Safe, constant, unshakable in her love. These children know that feeling now." Benjamin broke free from his hiding spot and ran to Miriam, wrapping his small arms around her legs. "Don't let them take us away," he whispered. "We want to stay with you." Tom and Emma came down the stairs together, flanking Miriam like young soldiers defending their fortress. The sight of the 3 children choosing her, publicly, defiantly, over the respectable alternative being offered made Miriam's throat tight with emotion. "This is highly irregular," Mr. Patterson muttered, but his pen had stopped moving. "Love usually is," James said quietly, "but it's the only thing that really works." Dr. Whitman snapped his bag shut with sharp clicks. "This isn't over. The county has resources, legal options. These children deserve better than this experiment." "They deserve exactly what they have," Miriam replied, her voice carrying a new note of authority. "A family that chose them, parents who see their worth, a home where they matter more than anyone's opinion." As the 3 men filed out of the house, their faces dark with disapproval, Miriam felt something she'd never experienced before. The absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The door closed behind them, but the echo of their threats remained. This battle wasn't over. But for the first time in her life, Miriam Fletcher McCready was ready to fight. 5 years passed like pages turning in a well-loved book, each season bringing new chapters to the McCready family story. On a crisp October morning that reminded Miriam of the day she'd first met James, she stood in her kitchen watching Emma pack a trunk for teacher's college, her heart full of pride and sorrow mixed together like bittersweet chocolate. "Remember to write every week," Miriam said, folding Emma's favorite blue dress with careful hands. "And don't let those city girls make you feel small. You're worth 10 of them." Emma hugged her tight. This young woman who'd grown from a frightened orphan into a confident teacher-to-be. "I learned that from watching you, Mama. You never let anyone make you feel small, not even when they tried their hardest." Through the window, Miriam could see Tom helping James repair the barn roof. The boy, now 17 and strong as an ox, planning to study agriculture at the state university next fall. Benjamin, 12 and tall for his age, was teaching their neighbor's young son how to whistle properly, his patience endless and his smile bright as summer sunshine. A knock at the front door interrupted her packing. When Miriam opened it, she found Mrs. Henderson standing on the porch, her face softer than it had been in years past. "Mrs. McCready," the older woman said, her voice carefully polite, "I wanted to speak with you before Emma leaves for school." Miriam tensed, waiting for another battle. Mrs. Henderson had never stopped disapproving of their unconventional family, though her criticism had grown quieter over the years as the McCready children flourished like flowers in good soil. My Sarah is planning to apply for teacher's college next year, Mrs. Henderson continued, twisting her gloves in her hands. I was wondering, that is, I hoped, perhaps Emma might write to her? Share some advice about the application process. The request surprised Miriam so much she nearly dropped the door handle. Mrs. Henderson was asking for help. From Emma. From them. From the family she'd once tried to destroy. I'm sure Emma would be happy to help, Miriam replied carefully. She remembers what it feels like to need guidance from someone who understands. Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with unexpected tears. I owe you an apology, Mrs. McCready. Several apologies, actually. I spoke cruel words about your family, and I was wrong. Miriam stepped aside, gesturing for the woman to come in. In the parlor, surrounded by photographs of school plays and church picnics and family celebrations, Mrs. Henderson seemed smaller somehow, less dangerous, more human. I watched your children grow up, Mrs. Henderson said quietly. Watched them become good, kind, successful people. Watched you love them through every scraped knee and broken heart and moment of triumph. I realized that everything I thought I knew about motherhood was limited. She pulled out a handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes. Sarah has struggled this year. She's 23 and still unmarried, still living at home, still believing that her worth depends on finding the right husband. But Emma, you're Emma. She knows her own mind, has her own dreams, carries herself like a woman who belongs in the world. Miriam poured tea into her best china cups, the ones James had given her for their third wedding anniversary. Emma learned that from necessity. All my children did. When you don't fit the world's expectations, you have to build your own foundation. That's what I want for Sarah, Mrs. Henderson admitted. That confidence, that sense of purpose, that knowledge that she matters beyond what others think of her. They talked for an hour about children and dreams and the hard work of raising humans who could stand on their own 2 feet. When Mrs. Henderson left, she squeezed Miriam's hand and said, "Thank you for showing our town what real motherhood looks like." That evening, as the family gathered for Emma's farewell dinner, Miriam found herself thinking about Dr. Whitman's visit 5 years earlier. The old doctor had died the previous winter, never seeing how wrong his predictions had been. The county officials had stopped their visits after the first year, when it became clear that the McCready children were thriving beyond anyone's expectations. "Mama," Benjamin said, reaching for another biscuit, "Mrs. Foster asked me today if you might consider taking in her nephew. His parents died in the influenza outbreak, and he's got nowhere to go." James looked up from carving the roast, his eyebrows raised in question. They'd talked about this possibility many times. Their house felt empty with just the 3 children, and there were always orphans needing homes. "What did you tell her?" Miriam asked. "I said she'd have to ask you and Papa, but that our family has room for one more if he wants to be part of it." Emma grinned across the table. "As long as he doesn't mind living with the most stubborn, protective, loving mother in Kansas." "The most stubborn, protective, loving mother anywhere," Tom corrected, raising his milk glass in a mock toast. Later, after the dishes were washed and Emma's trunk was loaded in the wagon for tomorrow's journey to the train station, Miriam sat on the front porch with James, watching the sunset paint the prairie sky in shades of gold and amber. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Dr. Whitman had been right?" she asked, her hand finding his in the gathering twilight. James squeezed her fingers gently. "About what?" "About me being unsuitable for motherhood. About the children needing someone different, someone better." He turned to face her, his blue eyes serious in the fading light. "Miriam, love, you are many things. Stubborn, yes, and fierce as a mama bear when your cubs are threatened. But unsuitable for motherhood? The only thing unsuitable about you was other people's narrow ideas of what motherhood should look like." Through the open windows behind them came the sounds of their children getting ready for bed. Tom reading to Benjamin, Emma humming while she brushed her hair. The comfortable chaos of a family secure in its love for each other. "Those children in there," James continued, "they didn't need a mother who fit society's mold. They needed exactly what you gave them. A woman who understood what it felt like to be rejected, who could teach them that their worth isn't determined by other people's opinions. Miriam leaned against his shoulder, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones like warm honey. Sometimes I think about that day in the schoolhouse, when you first said there was room for two souls seeking peace. And now I think peace isn't something you find. It's something you build, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time. The first stars appeared overhead, pinpricks of light in the vast Kansas sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Emma's departure, the possibility of another child joining their family, the endless work of raising humans in an imperfect world. But tonight, Miriam Fletcher McCready sat on her porch surrounded by the sounds of her chosen family, wearing the copper ring that had worn smooth with years of love, knowing that she had become exactly what she was meant to be. Not despite her differences, but because of them. The girl who'd been told she was too fat to give birth had indeed never given birth. But she had given life in ways Dr. Whitman could never have imagined. To children who needed choosing, to a community that needed expanding, to herself in the process of becoming someone who knew her own immeasurable worth. And that, she thought as Benjamin's sleepy voice called good night from his window, was the most important truth of all.